In the spring of 1834, somewhere among the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery surfaced that bent the human imagination toward its darkest edge. 47 children, no two alike speaking in a scatter of tongues, were found shackled in the bowels of a farmhouse that to passing eyes seemed ordinary. Their ages ran from 6 to 16. Their eyes were ravaged by hunger and fear. When questioned, they could manage only a single name, breathed more than spoken through cracked lips and tears: Mother Sullivan. The sheriff's account, eventually misfiled and forgotten in the Henry County archives for more than a century, recorded scenes so desolating that 3 officers left the force within a week. The horror was not only in what lay below those floorboards, but in what the evidence implied. That Constance Sullivan had run her design for over 20 years, unseen. The children called her mother, but that word, so tender in other mouths, hid a meaning colder than the earth that confined them. Before we return to the Sullivans and their house of quiet ruin, a word to you who are listening. This is not a story for the comfortable. It asks something of the heart and offers no easy rest in return. This place is kept for those who meet the past without blinking, who accept that some truths should disturb us and yet must be faced. If you have followed this far, you are already among the few. Tell us where you're listening from, what state claims your nights, and whether you will stand when the story turns toward your own backyard. What haunts investigators then and scholars now is how such an enterprise could grow and feed for so long in a rural circle where neighbors knew one another's footsteps. Virginia in 1834 hovered between worlds. The old plantation order still ruled the fields. Faint rumors of industry drifted south with the mail. In this weather, the small settlement of Millbrook, 50 families dispersed along Henry County's gentle slopes, looked exactly as the young country imagined itself. Tolerably self-sufficient, mild, slow to change. Most families raised tobacco or corn, bartered at Henderson's general store, and gathered in a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a hall when anyone needed to speak to everyone. The Sullivan tract stood at the settlement's edge, a modest 2-story frame house set in nearly 200 acres of shapely land. To any stranger rolling along the dusty path toward Richmond, the farm was unremarkable. The house, done in the Federal style from the previous generation, wore white clapboards and a wraparound porch like a Sunday coat. A red barn sat 60 yards behind, with a chicken coop and a smokehouse to finish the usual scene. No traveler could guess what failed to meet the eye. That secret lay underground. Ezra Sullivan had bought the place in 1809, his purse fattened by a tobacco inheritance. What he expanded afterwards was not the parlor or the roofline, but the earth beneath. Where most Virginia homes kept a simple root cellar, the Sullivan basement grew outward and downward past the home's footprint, a hive without light. Craftsmen still living in the county near century's end would recall those years. Odd excavations here, stonework there, paid in cash, work divided into sections no one was permitted to stitch together in imagination. Ezra's instructions were always narrow. Attend to your portion, ask no questions, take your money, and go. Constance Sullivan appeared in Millbrook in 1811, a bride of 22. Neighbors remembered the dark hair, the soft and steady voice. She dressed with care but without display, went to the Methodist service when health permitted, and carried a reputation for gentle charity. When the community asked for donations, she spoke of several orphan children of her Pennsylvania kin already in her care. It was temporary, she told them. only until proper homes could be arranged. That story, delivered with her particular gravity, satisfied curiosity about the occasional glimpse of small faces at the Sullivan place. Mrs. Henderson at the store remembered a pair of eyes appearing above the sideboard of the wagon when Constance came to buy. The children never spoke. Constance said they were timid, crushed by grief, and not yet equal to strangers. In a time when death made orphans with pitiless regularity, the town accepted the explanation and turned the page. Thomas Henderson, the merchant, later said Constance was among his most predictable customers. Every fortnight, she arrived with a careful list and the cash to match it, buying large amounts of flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, enough to feed a small household, perhaps two. When he mentioned the size of her orders, Constance would remind him, gently, about the orphans. She bought medicines in unusual quantity, too. Liniments and powders, tinctures for cough and fever, explaining that children arriving from hard luck were always ailing at first. Neighbors noticed the farm's curious timetable. Most families rose with the sun and finished in the long pink of dusk. The Sullivans worked into the night. Lamps burned in the windows at odd hours. Hammers knocked after dark. When asked, Ezra said he was adding rooms to make space for the increasing number of children they were nursing toward adoption. The traveling physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, remembered being summoned to the farm several times over the 1820s and early 1830s. Each visit, the story was the same. One of the orphans was ill. A particular medicine was needed, yet he was never allowed to see a single patient. Constance would recite symptoms in a low voice, precise and practiced. When Whitfield insisted on an examination, she said the children were too frightened of strange men and could not bear it. Even the pastor believed. Reverend Samuel Matthews would visit and offer prayers. He applauded the Sullivans for Christian charity and volunteered to help place the orphans. Constance always had a letter to show, a hand from Pennsylvania that promised arrangements were underway. It needed time, she said, care and patience. No one guessed that patience was her instrument. Under the modest surface, Constance had layered a deception refined over decades. The children were not waiting for homes. They were possessions, purchased when possible, stolen when necessary, lured when convenient, gathered from neighboring states, and kept in a cold order that would unmake a hardened man. The unraveling began in the hard season of that year. February had punished Virginia with iron cold. The freeze would harm and help the 47 beneath the Sullivan floors, starving them further, sharpening sound, carrying breath and noise in ways warmer air does not. On February 23, 1834, a merchant named Jacob Stern pushed west from Richmond, only to be caught in a snapping snowstorm. The Sullivan house surfaced from the white like a reprieve, and Ezra could not refuse a traveler in such weather. However, his face suggested he would have liked to. Stern later said the evening felt strained, the conversation thin and jerking. Constance served cornbread and salt pork. Their gazes strayed to the doors at the slightest noise. When Stern asked after the orphans he had heard the town mention, Constance said they were asleep and feverish, better left undisturbed. It was the sound that lodged in Stern's head. In the night, as he lay on a pallet in the parlor, he heard what seemed like crying under the floor, a muffled, bleached-out weeping. In the morning, Ezra called it wind, the old house whistling. In winter, he said, the foundation complained like that. Stern accepted the words, but not the tone. 3 weeks later, on March 15th, a second thread frayed. Mary Catherine Flynn, young, Irish, newly arrived, lost her way near a river crossing as her family traveled toward the tobacco fields. At dusk, she reached the Sullivans. Constant took her in. Mary Catherine did not rejoin the world. Her family reported her missing in Richmond. A search party moved through woods too deep and time too cold. After a week, the hunt ended. People said exposure, or animals, a tragedy lost among many. The third and final incident came on April 2nd. William Hutchinson, a farmer hunting rabbits near the Sullivan lines, stopped when he heard children screaming. Not play, not squabbles, terror. He crept to a stand of oaks 50 yards off and waited. The sound came and went, thinner than wind, deeper than wood, always from beneath the house. He watched Ezra step out of a low door sunk into the foundation, glance around, and vanish again underground. When Hutchinson carried what he'd seen to his neighbors, the town divided itself along the soft seam of doubt. Some said troubled children demanded harsh measures. Others, slow at first, began to tug at small recollections. The heavy grocery lists, the late hammering, the silence of children who never once appeared at church or at the schoolhouse gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, 15 years in the Henrio County saddle, put it down as gossip. But Hutchinson pressed, and pressed formally, and the law obliged. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Crawford rode out with his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived shortly after sunrise, expecting to nod, to look over a few rooms, to return with a small note that quieted rumor. Constant met them, calm, hospitable, coffee poured, voice lowered with concern about the talk. She told her story again. Orphans from Pennsylvania kin, letters on the table, illness keeping them upstairs and asleep. She would arrange interviews when they were stronger. It sounded reasonable enough until Deputy Webb asked for the privy and walked the yard. There, the cellar door, exactly where Hutchinson had placed it, dragged his breath short. 3 large padlocks closed it, chains bit into the wood, and the frame around the hasps bore raw marks, splintered and raked, the sort made by fingernails running out of hope. Webb returned to Crawford and spoke low. Both men understood what the law required when a door looked like that. The sheriff asked politely to see the cellar. A thorough inspection, he said, would end the talk. The change in Constant was immediate and colorless. The blood left her face. Her hands shook, words coming apart as she spoke of danger, of children forbidden to enter that space, of tools and stores and nothing worth a glance. Then, from beneath the kitchen where they stood, a sound rose that ended every sentence at once. Crying, thin and human, followed by a voice so faint it might have been memory asking for help. They forced the cellar door. The first thing to greet them was not sight, but air. A reek pushed up the steps. Waste, bodies unwashed, and something the sheriff would later call the raw odor of despair. The space beneath the Sullivan farmhouse stretched like a wound cut into the earth. The walls were stone, the ceiling low, the air heavy with damp. What the sheriff and his deputy found there would follow them into every dream that came after. The main chamber ran wider than the house above it, built with method, not madness. Each stone laid to muffle the sound of life beneath. Iron rings had been driven deep into the walls, and from those rings, chains. 47 children, no more than ghosts of their kind, huddled against the rock. Ankles bound, flesh rubbed raw. The older ones too thin to stand, the younger too weak to weep. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They only stared up through the gloom at the 2 men who had come, as if rescue were a word they no longer remembered. Deputy Webb turned aside to vomit. Sheriff Crawford stood motionless, his mind resisting the scene, refusing to accept that what lay before him was real. In smaller rooms branching off the main chamber, they found other instruments of order and pain. One held stocks and bindings, another, a crude table stained with old use and a shelf of tinctures and bandages. A third was a study of sorts, filled with ledgers, records written in a careful hand. Names, dates of arrival, brief notes on behavior, page after page. The earliest dated back to 1812, a year after Constance came to Millbrook. Each entry marked a child's entry into the darkness. 90 names in all. 47 still alive. The question that neither man wanted to ask found its answer in a narrow crawl space at the far end of the cellar. Beneath the packed earth lay the others. At least 36 small bodies, layered and forgotten, dusted with lime. Some had starved, others bore the unmistakable marks of violence. Crawford and Webb sealed the place and sent for help, but the sight, the bones, the smallness of them, would not release them for the rest of their days. In the weeks that followed, Millbrook learned what its silence had hidden. The investigation that began in that basement would stretch on for months as the authorities tried to comprehend how such a cruelty could root itself in ordinary soil. And at the center of it all stood one woman whose voice had soothed her neighbors into blindness. Constance Sullivan's genius lay not in strength, but in patience. She understood the theater of virtue. The pious woman caring for orphans fit neatly into the moral fabric of her time. Her story borrowed the community's own compassion and turned it into camouflage. Children too traumatized to speak explained their silence. Children too frightened to appear in public excused their invisibility. Relatives in Pennsylvania accounted for every question about departure or delay. Her web was spun from the threads of decency itself. The structure of her world was built with equal cunning. The basement's growth over 2 decades concealed its design from any single worker. Each mason or carpenter saw only a fragment of the plan. The walls themselves were layered to swallow sound. Screams could not climb through them. The illusion was nearly perfect, an unremarkable farmhouse with a hell beneath it. What was perhaps most terrible was how she kept her prisoners alive. She had studied it like a craft. Rations calculated to sustain, not comfort. Punishments chosen not to kill, but to instruct. The children were told the world outside was worse than this, that their parents had sold them, that they had nowhere to return to. Those who obeyed were given crumbs of favor. Those who resisted became examples. Over time, most forgot to resist at all. They learned to be still, to call her mother, to believe that obedience was safety. The town's disbelief when the truth emerged was nearly as deep as its shame. For years afterward, neighbors tried to explain it away. They said perhaps her husband had forced her. Perhaps she had lost her mind. Perhaps it was something else, something beyond human understanding. But the records told a different story, one of calculation, commerce, and design. Among the papers seized in the cellar were letters written in a simple cipher. When the code was broken, it spoke of deliveries, merchandise, and quality. The words were mercantile, but the cargo was human. The correspondence mapped a network that reached far beyond Virginia. From Pennsylvania to Georgia, other names surfaced: suppliers, buyers, intermediaries. Constance Sullivan was not alone. She was one node in a lattice of misery that trafficked children across state lines for profit and purpose too monstrous to name. One letter, dated that January, came from a Morrison in Philadelphia. He wrote of 6 new items suitable for her needs. Each description reduced a child to an inventory: age, condition, temperament, trainability. The numbers were precise: $50 for a frail one, $200 for the strong. Over 2 decades, the sum of her trade measured in thousands, money enough to buy the silence of more than one man. The physician, Dr. Whitfield, found himself implicated by ignorance. He testified later that Constance's requests for medicine had always been unusually exact. Remedies for malnutrition, infection, fever, sedatives to quiet the unruly. She knew what she was doing, he said, better than many trained nurses. It became clear that her charity had been an experiment in endurance, a study in how long a child could live with less than enough. Thomas Henderson's ledgers told their own truth. The purchases, flour, molasses, pork, rose year after year. The farm that looked so modest from the road was feeding an army below it. Henderson remembered, too, the strange orders: bolts of coarse cloth, children's clothing, jars of lime. At the time, it seemed only odd. In hindsight, each item carried the weight of an unspoken purpose. Ezra Sullivan's role proved simpler, but no less vile. He was the hand that enforced what his wife devised. The surviving children, once their voices returned, spoke of him as the keeper, the punisher, the one who worked the locks and the whip. His years of construction had not built comfort, but confinement, perfecting a design meant to hold flesh and fear in equal measure. As investigators read deeper into the ledgers, they found not only the records of those who remained, but the traces of those who had vanished. Some were marked transferred, others unsuitable. Those words matched the graves beneath the floor. The case swelled beyond the county, and federal marshals, rare in those days, were called in to manage the widening circle of the crime. For the first time, a rural horror demanded the attention of a nation. From other states came notices of missing children, whose descriptions matched those found in the Sullivan cellar. Orphans from Pennsylvania, runaways from Maryland, lost farmhands from the Carolinas. The web stretched wider with every discovery, until even seasoned lawmen stood in stunned silence at the scale of it. In time, the survivors began to speak, slowly, painfully. They told of years measured in dark and hunger, of punishments meant to shape obedience, of rewards that were scraps of bread or a kind word that meant nothing and everything. They spoke of how new arrivals were broken down, isolated, beaten, starved, until they forgot the idea of freedom. Older children were given small privileges, made into guards to keep the rest in line. It was a system, meticulous and merciless, built on fear and the slow erasure of self. Among them was a girl named Rebecca, 14 years old, who had endured longer than most. She carried within her memory a map, faces, names, conversations whispered in the half-light. She remembered being taken from her family's farm in Pennsylvania when she was 9. A woman had come, claiming kinship, offering sweets and a carriage ride to town. Rebecca remembered waking in chains. More than that, she remembered visitors to the farm, men and women who came to inspect, to bargain, to buy. It was from her recollection that the investigators drew the first clear outline of the network's reach. She told them of a recent visit, just 2 weeks before the discovery, when a wealthy man in fine clothes had arrived in a carriage. He examined her and 3 others like livestock, checking their teeth, their posture, their eyes. He left behind a letter describing the sort of children he wished to purchase: specific ages, temperaments, physical traits. The language was cold, transactional, without a hint of conscience. The signature read simply, H. Blackwood, Charleston, South Carolina. The name cracked open another world. Henry Blackwood was known across the South, a man of land and influence, his plantations among the largest in the region. His connection to the Sullivan farm suggested that the trade in children had not merely been a rural aberration, but part of something broader, older, and bound to power. The more they looked, the more they found the same pattern repeated. Money traveling one way, children the other, disappearing into the labyrinth of Southern wealth. For those taken by Blackwood and his peers, captivity did not end in labor. It descended into experiments, entertainments, and acts that no record could fully describe. The plantation, the letters hinted, held its own dark laboratories, its own places where screams went unheard. When this part of the story surfaced, even the investigators turned away from the full account. The documents that did survive were sealed. Some say they remain sealed still. By the summer of 1834, the Sullivan case had ceased to be a local scandal. It had become an open wound in the conscience of a young nation. But the greater horror was yet to come, and the cost of uncovering it would claim the lives and sanity of more than one who dared to look too closely. Samuel Pierce came forward in late autumn of that same year, a man worn down by guilt, hollow-eyed, and trembling as though the act of speaking would damn him further. He had been an overseer on the Blackwood plantation, a witness to what had become of the children sent south from the Sullivan farm. His testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond tore away the final veil that polite society had drawn across the face of evil. He spoke without flourish, his words clipped, often faltering under the weight of memory. On the Blackwood estate, he said, two worlds had existed side by side. The first, the visible one, was a plantation like any other. Cotton fields, enslaved labor, the commerce of the South's inherited cruelty. But hidden beyond a stretch of cypress woods lay another compound, enclosed and forbidden. They called it the experimental quarters. Here the trafficked children lived and died, their lives spent not in toil, but in torment. Blackwood and his associates, two physicians from Charleston Medical College among them, used the children as material for what they termed research. They tested poisons and tonics, traced the progression of diseases they themselves had sown, and recorded each reaction with the precision of men convinced that curiosity excused all things. Pierce remembered the ledgers, columns of figures detailing survival rates, dosages, days to death. The children were numbered, not named. The grand jury sat in silence as he spoke of nights when he heard the cries from that hidden building, and of mornings when the sound was gone and the ground behind the quarters was newly turned. 37 children from the Sullivan network had reached Blackwood's hands. Only 4 were ever transferred onward. The rest were buried in shallow, unmarked graves in the swamp behind the plantation. Pierce's confession did more than expose a single man's depravity. It revealed a system. Blackwood's correspondence led investigators to other estates, other buyers, planters, doctors, even men in office, who had treated the trade in children as an unspoken privilege of power. They spoke of them as subjects, as servants, as resources. Each word was an act of erasure. The breaking point came with Pierce's account of an autumn gathering in 1833. Blackwood had hosted it himself, calling it a demonstration. Wealthy men from across the South arrived in their finery, drank from silver cups, and walked the rows of terrified children as if through a market. They tested obedience, endurance, pain. The event was recorded like a business meeting. Orders were placed, payments promised. Some of the men laughed as the smallest cried. Those who listened to Pierce could hardly breathe. Hardened lawmen turned away. Yet his words were corroborated by the evidence seized in the subsequent raids. Ledgers, letters, medical instruments, and human remains. The web of complicity stretched for 30 years and across half the nation. Hundreds of children had vanished into it. The raids came suddenly, before news could leak. Federal marshals struck plantations, warehouses, and boarding houses in a single week of coordinated violence and rescue. Over 100 living children were found. Most had forgotten how to speak. The air in those places was the same as beneath the Sullivan house. Stale, damp, heavy with the echo of muffled crying. Among the arrested were Henry Blackwood himself, the two Charleston physicians, and a state legislator whose name was quietly erased from public record soon after. The documents seized from their possession painted a world so methodical in its horror that the nation staggered beneath it. Diseases bred for study, vivisections performed without mercy, surgical trials recorded with the precision of accountants. In their minds, science and suffering had become indistinguishable. The corruption that made it all possible was as sprawling as the crime itself. Orphanage officials had been bribed to surrender children, judges had signed false adoption papers, constables had been paid to misplace reports. The system was not the work of monsters hidden in shadows. It was built by ordinary men who looked away, one coin at a time. The trials dragged on for years. The Sullivans' basement had birthed a new kind of justice, one the courts scarcely knew how to hold. Laws against kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder could be applied, but there was no language yet for what had been done to these children. The machinery of the young republic strained to comprehend it. Ezra Sullivan faced his judgment first. His wife had died in her cell before she could speak. The jailer found her hanging from a strip of torn bedding, though many whispered that her death had been arranged by those who wished her silence permanent. Ezra confessed before the noose took him in Richmond in November of 1836. He begged forgiveness from the children he had chained, calling himself a servant of the devil, and wept until his voice failed. Henry Blackwood's trial drew crowds so vast that the courthouse steps became a marketplace. People came not for justice but for spectacle, to glimpse the man whose wealth had hidden such depravity. The medical records found on his plantation left little doubt. Yet power does not surrender easily. His lawyers delayed his execution through appeals and influence until he died behind bars in 1841, a supposed heart failure that many believed was poison. The physicians were less fortunate. Both were convicted and imprisoned, stripped of title and practice. Their downfall forced the medical profession to reckon with its absence of conscience. Still, many of the powerful escaped. Some fled overseas before warrants could reach them. Others, cushioned by family names and wealth, faced only censure or exile. The legal system, designed by and for their kind, had no appetite for dismantling itself. The money they made remained hidden, scattered through banks and businesses that would one day fund railroads and factories. Progress built, in part, upon the bones of children no one had wanted to remember. The Sullivan farm itself became a scar on the Virginia hills. Seized by the government and later auctioned, it stood empty for years. No buyer could bear its history. Eventually, the house was torn down, the cellar filled and sealed with concrete. The ground was consecrated with a small graveyard, a stone bearing only a number. 47 found, 36 lost. In the years that followed, states across the country passed new laws. Virginia led the way, crafting the first statutes to guard orphaned and abandoned children from private custody. Pennsylvania, Maryland, the Carolinas soon followed. The federal government moved slowly but began to shape what would become the framework for child protection and interstate law enforcement. The Sullivan case had forced the nation to see that cruelty could not be confined by borders or hidden behind piety. The public devoured the story with a mixture of fascination and dread. Newspapers printed every detail, some embellishing the horror until it bordered on the unreal. But the core truth remained. Evil had lived in their midst, dressed in the plain clothes of respectability. Of the survivors, few found peace. Some were placed in charitable homes. Others drifted between institutions, unable to adjust to the ordinary daylight of the world. Many died young. Those who lived carried their memories like invisible chains. Rebecca, the girl whose testimony had cracked the case open, was taken in by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. They gave her silence and safety, which she accepted but never trusted. She married, bore children, lived quietly to the age of 73, and never again spoke of the cellar. The years eroded the details, but not the dread. The phrase, "another Sullivan case," entered the language as a warning, a reminder that virtue unexamined can hide rot beneath its smile. For those who had seen it firsthand, there was no forgetting. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, whose medicines had unknowingly sustained the captives, turned his guilt into devotion. He opened free clinics for orphaned children, arguing that neglect was itself a form of murder. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was promoted to federal marshal, dedicating the rest of his life to hunting those who preyed on the young. His reports on the Sullivan investigation became required reading for officers long after his death. And yet, even as reforms spread, the shadow remained. The documents preserved from the case, letters, ledgers, testimonies, would later reveal that the Sullivan farm had not been unique. Other basements existed. Other children had vanished. Some were never found. In Millbrook, the townsfolk lived with the ghost of their blindness. They asked themselves how they could have failed to see. The lights burning at odd hours, the food purchased in bulk, the silence of children who never spoke. Every memory became an accusation. It is said that on quiet nights, long after the farmhouse was torn down, travelers passing through the hills would hear faint sounds rising from beneath the earth, a chorus of small voices carried on the wind, calling for a mother who would never answer. The Sullivan case did more than scar a county. It changed a nation. It proved that evil need not roar or boast. It can whisper in gentle tones, wear clean clothes, and smile from a porch at sunset. If you've listened this far, you understand what the historians mean when they say the past is never gone. It waits beneath our feet, sealed but not silent. And somewhere in the dark earth of Virginia, beneath the soil that drank their sorrow, the children of Mother Sullivan still dream of daylight. Time passed, but the echoes did not fade. The story of the Sullivan children became more than a crime. It became a reckoning. What had begun as a discovery beneath a farmhouse in rural Virginia now stood as an unhealed wound in the American conscience. A reminder that beneath progress and pride, there were always places where the light had never reached. The official records ended with the executions and reforms, but the story itself did not. For decades, travelers who took the road from Richmond to Charlottesville spoke of unease near the old Sullivan property. The land was quiet, overgrown, its fences long since fallen. But people said the air there held a kind of heaviness, a weight that pressed on the lungs. Horses shied away from the stretch of ground where the house had once stood. Some claimed that on cold nights, when the wind moved through the grass, it carried with it the faintest sound, a child sobbing, a chain dragged slowly across stone. Those who lived nearby did not speak of it openly. The past was too large, too shameful to name aloud. The county records were sealed, the names of the victims lost to time. Yet the legend persisted, carried by whisper and superstition. They said the basement, though filled and sealed, still breathed, that the earth above it shifted after heavy rain, as if something below it moved restlessly in sleep. Historians who later examined the case came to see it as a mirror held up to a young nation's soul. America in the early 19th century was a country enamored with its own virtue, convinced of its exceptionalism. The Sullivan case shattered that illusion. It showed how cruelty could thrive not in the wilderness, but in the very heart of civility, among churchgoers, merchants, and farmers who believed themselves decent. Evil, it turned out, required only indifference and the quiet willingness to look away. Over the years, the documents from the investigation were studied and cataloged. The ledgers, the coded letters, the testimonies, all became part of the early history of American law enforcement and reform. Scholars would later say that the Sullivan investigation marked the birth of organized child protection in the United States. From that horror, laws were written, agencies formed, and awareness kindled. Yet even the most devoted reformers confessed that progress could never undo what had been done. The children's graves remained unnamed. When the government erected a small monument on the site in 1845, the inscription read simply, "To the innocents found below." No list of names, no ages, no origin. Just a marker on an empty field that once held the weight of 47 chained souls. The locals avoided it, save for the occasional mourner who left flowers or a small toy carved from wood, tokens for children no one had claimed. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford lived to see the last of the trials concluded. He retired from public service not long after, his health failing under the burden of what he had seen. Those who knew him said he rarely spoke of the Sullivan case, except once, in a letter found among his papers after his death. "It is the silence that kills a man," he wrote. "The silence of the ones we could not save." Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who had spent the rest of his life tending to abandoned children, died years later in his clinic. On his desk was a single, well-worn photograph of the memorial stone in Henry County. The back bore his handwriting, "To atone, one must never forget." Rebecca, the girl whose courage had given voice to the voiceless, lived out her life quietly in the Pennsylvania countryside. In her old age, she tended a garden filled with white lilies and spent her evenings by the window, watching the light fade over the fields. When she died in 1898, her family found among her things a small piece of chain, rusted and broken, wrapped in a length of ribbon. There was no note. Only that silent fragment of iron kept for nearly 60 years, as though she had carried a piece of the darkness with her always. The Sullivan case slipped slowly from public memory, as such things do. Time dulled the outrage, then the fascination, until only the faint outline of the story remained. A cautionary tale, half history, half ghost story. But those who studied it closely, who read the words of those who had walked through that cellar, understood that the true horror was not only in what was done, but in how easily it had been hidden. The Sullivans had lived among their neighbors for 20 years. They had traded at the store, attended church, exchanged polite greetings on the road. The community had seen everything and nothing. Their blindness had not been forced upon them. It had been chosen quietly, one moment of disbelief at a time. That was the real lesson of the Sullivan case, that evil does not always arrive with fire and fury. Sometimes it comes as kindness, as charity, as a woman with a soft voice who claims to love children. In the generations that followed, the name Sullivan became a shadow spoken of only in passing. The land was sold again and again, until the boundaries blurred and the memory of what had once stood there grew faint. Yet the story would surface from time to time in unexpected places. A school teacher warning her pupils about Mother Sullivan, a farmer swearing he saw lantern light on the field at night, a traveler who claimed to hear whispers rising from the earth. Whether the dead still lingered there or the living simply could not forget, no one could say. But every tale shared the same unshakable feeling, that some sorrows are too great for burial. Today, the Sullivan farm exists only as a field and a scar. The road still bends around the land, and the soil still shifts when the frost thaws in spring. Beneath it, perhaps, lie the remnants of walls, the faint imprint of rings in stone. The children's names are gone, but their story endures, in court records, in history books, and in the uneasy dreams of a nation that once let such darkness thrive in silence. The Sullivan case reminds us that evil rarely begins with monsters. It begins with neglect, with the comfort of not asking questions, with the quiet surrender of empathy. It begins when good people convince themselves that horror cannot happen here. And so, when the wind moves across the Virginia hills at dusk and the last light fades from the sky, the land seems to breathe again. The trees lean toward the earth as if listening, and from somewhere deep below, one might almost imagine the sound of chains falling away, one by one. The story of the Sullivan children is not only about what was lost, but about what remains. The burden of remembrance, the duty to see, and the fragile mercy of bearing witness. For the darkness of history never truly ends. It waits, patient as the soil, for someone brave enough to dig again. If you can still hear their echoes, if the image of that farmhouse clings to your thoughts after the sound has faded, then you understand. Some stories do not end. They linger in the walls, in the ground, in us. And perhaps, in the long silence of night, that is what the children of Mother Sullivan have always wanted. To be remembered, to be heard, to never, ever again be left beneath the floorboards of the world.